So welcome everyone to our third session in the series that we've been organizing through the Center for Arts and Humanities at AUB, the Critical Humanities Program, and the Critical Approaches to Development. And we're very happy to welcome our two speakers, whom I will briefly introduce, and then they will each speak for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll kind of open it up to a Q&A. For everyone who is with us in the who's kind of joining us, sorry about the various so you know interventions will be taken towards the end in terms of raising a hand and then being able to speak. Besides that, participants can't kind of share or post anything for various reasons. We've had some incidents involving Zoom bombing before, which were quite unpleasant. If it does happen, we're trying to work around it. Just, I don't know, close your eyes and wait it out until we figure out how to get whoever does that out of the room. So I'm very pleased to introduce Drs. Rafeef, Ziadah, and Brenna Bhandar. I'll just say a few things about each of our speakers and then open it up. Rafeef is a senior lecturer in politics in the Department of International Development at King's College London. Her research focuses broadly on political economy, gender, and race, with a particular focus on West Asia and East Africa. She is the co-editor with Brenna Bhandar, who is our other speaker, of the book Revolutionary Feminisms that came out with Verso Press in 2020. And her research on infrastructure and maritime politics has appeared in numerous academic journals. She has been an organizer with multiple Palestinian grassroots campaigns and is well known for her spoken word poetry. And Dr. Brenna Bhandar is Associate Professor at Allard Law at the University of British Columbia. Brenna's research and teaching broadly lie within the fields of property studies and legal theory, spanning the disciplines of property law, critical theory, colonial legal history, and critical race feminisms. Her book, Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land, and Racial Regimes of Ownership, was published in 2018 with Duke University Press. And she has this co-edited book that I just mentioned with Rafeef on revolutionary feminism, published with Verso in 2020. So I won't say more, but there's plenty to say about both our speakers, but I'll just open now the time for speaking. I think, is it Rafeef, will you go at the beginning, or Brenna? Yeah, is that fine, or did you? I didn't, okay, good. All right, so please go ahead. Sorry, wait, I don't know why. Okay, is that working now?
I think yes. You should be able to hear me now. Okay, great. Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I must start by admitting that it's very difficult to speak nowadays and very difficult to try and make very coherent theoretical arguments. So I hope everybody can bear with me. It is very difficult to find words. Not just because of the televised massacres and the numbers of deaths we have seen in the past month, not just the life-changing injuries, the flesh and bones burned and broken, and the trauma we will all have to live with for some time. Above being an academic, I am a Palestinian and I'm a Palestinian refugee. So this moment is not simply a moment for analysis, it is also a moment for action. And unfortunately, as Palestinians, we always have to exist in both these roles at the same time, in feeling our trauma and feeling our loss, while organizing and trying to think of the long term and trying to understand the settler colonial project that is Israel. One thing I want to say at the offset is that we have heard a lot in the past month about the death and the loss of women and children. I want to say that our men are no less worthy, and their life is no less worthy. Each one of them is a moon, a star, an entire constellation to us, and each of them have lifted the world on their shoulders in the past month, comforting babies, saving lives, looking through the rubble, so they are no less worthy. This ugliness and brutality that we have seen unleashed by Israel was also cheered on by the British government, the US government, and the EU, the same states that give Israel consistent diplomatic cover, military aid, to continue its settler colonial project over the entirety of the Palestinian people. In the past month, we have also seen many so-called liberal values come crashing down. freedom of expression, freedom to protest, academic freedom have all come under full attack. As Palestinian organizers, we know they have never been fully realized in the first place, but it has been quite something to witness the quashing of Palestinian voices and the silencing of academics in solidarity with Palestine, the harassment of students who are in solidarity with Palestine. But at the same time, we have seen some remarkable mass mobilizations and impressive creative actions by ordinary people, workers and students all over the world. Students have walked out of classrooms from London to Australia. Dock workers have refused to handle Israeli ships. Of course, there's a lot more work to be done, and we wish it had taken place sooner. We wish it didn't have to wait for an entire genocidal onslaught for people to realize that the destruction of Palestine has been ongoing. But just to say that I know in our academic circuits, they tend to very much be inflamed with the US-Israeli narratives. And we forget that sometimes stepping outside those circuits, that the majority of the world is actually with Palestine and with Palestinians. There have been numerous needs to explain the specific operations and intricacies of Israel's settler colonial project over the past month, because memories are short and people forget. So largely, because Israel works to hide these facts and hide its settler colonial project over the entirety of the Palestinian people, I wanted to take us back a little to basics today, why we call Israel a settler colonial project. And there's two things I really want to stress. Fragmentation as a pillar of this settler colonial project, and economic strangulation as the second pillar of this project. And I know there's been a lot said about fragmentation. There's often less said about economic strangulation. So I wanted to make sure that we see both of these as interconnected facets of Israel's settler colonial project. Over decades, Israeli settler colonialism has been acting with support from Western powers and their regional allies to fragment the Palestinian people, to occupy as much of the land while taking no responsibility for the population or ethnically cleansing the population. It is a policy of purposeful disintegration of Palestinians, resulting in a set of disjointed and dispersed territories in the hope that this would evolve into distinct social formations that are separate trajectories from each other, where people do not identify themselves as Palestinians anymore. This stratification is reflected in the categories that are employed to delineate the Palestinian demographic landscape. So we have Palestinian refugees that are either in the occupied territories or in exile, like myself. We have Palestinians who have remained inside their lands and have subsequently assumed Israeli citizenship. We have the compartmentalization of the West Bank into isolated cantons, the segregation of the West Bank from the Gaza, and presently, of course, the de facto partition of East Jerusalem from the West Bank. And of course, Jerusalem used to be the economic center of the West Bank. So to comprehend the broader Zionist project and Israeli settler colonial project, we really need a nuanced examination of how Israeli power operates against the entirety of the Palestinian population. I know that today all eyes are on Gaza, but we need to remember that Gaza is an indivisible part of the Palestinian nation. This logic of fragmentation extends beyond spatial considerations. It also encompasses a temporal disruption. In other words, Israeli power relies not just on the geographical fragmentation of Palestinians into separate spheres, but it's also an assault on our very history. It dehistoricizes the Palestinian experience and reduces it into accepting this fragmentation as de facto and permanent. Temporal disruption makes it possible today, for example, to speak of Gazans, for example, with no reference to how this category itself was constructed through the forcible fragmentation of the Palestinian people as a whole, first in 1948, and then through the separation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So let's break down this process of fragmentation and how it has unfolded in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel's strategy here has been the same from the very beginning, and it has been strategic, aiming to take control of the Palestinian population without incurring any costs. This strategy isn't a recent development. It traces back to the rationale of the Israeli settler colonial project, maximum land, minimum people. In the occupied territories in particular, it can be traced back to the Allon Plan of 1967 after the occupation, where it was explicitly outlined how this method of domination by remote control would work through division, through the annexation of Jerusalem. What is really fascinating to see today is how the maps that Israel has created mirror this Allon Plan from 1967. In fact, it is an even worse fragmentation than that plan had predicted. In the 1990s, under the auspices of the Oslo Accords signed by the PLO and Israel, this control strategy evolved into a complex bureaucratic framework involving permits, checkpoints, and zoning laws. This intricate system manages the movement of people and goods across the patchwork of territories in the West Bank, with Gaza existing as its own self-contained fragment. The military orders, which have governed Palestinian life since 1967, are still very much in play, but it doesn't stop there. Israel has a tight grip on essentials like electricity, water, cellular communications, and the internet. Palestinian companies might market these services, but when you dig deeply into the infrastructures and how they operate, the ultimate supply and control lies in the hands of Israel. So despite the veneer of autonomy of the Oslo process, all it did was introduce a more nuanced and entrenched form of control over Palestinians that in the long term has made it more difficult to actually work against the fragmentation. Moving quickly to my second point, we cannot divorce this geographical fragmentation from the control over the economic system. The process of fragmentation, land theft, land dispossession has always come hand in hand with the destruction of the Palestinian economy, ensuring that Palestinians are not able to survive. The Palestinian economy today, at its core, is intricately entwined with a heavy reliance on Israel. Back in the 1970s and the 1980s, this dependency intensified due to military orders that not only hindered Palestinian industrial and agricultural growth, but also tethered the pool of affordable Palestinian labor to the Israeli economy. So we had military orders that would destroy the Palestinian economy in its sectors, industrial and agricultural, but also the absorption of Palestinian labor into the Israeli economy. Following the occupation in 1967, Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip were progressively incorporated into the Israeli economy as a source of cheap labor, highly exploitable. Commuting daily into Israel to work in sectors such as construction, agriculture, and industry, Palestinians filled the lowest rungs of the Israeli labor market and covered some of the labor shortfall caused by prolonged military service for the Jewish citizens of Israel. Through the 1970s, this labor helped underpin an economic expansion of Israel that was dubbed the Palestinian boom. By the mid-1980s, Palestinians from the occupied territories made up around 7% of the Israeli labor force. Around 1/3 of the West Bank labor force worked in Israel in 1985. So you could see the change here and how much it increased. They also worked in vital sectors for the Israeli economy, and it essentially were the supply of labor that could keep that economy moving. The integration of Palestinian labor into the Israeli economy not only served Israel's economic needs, but further solidified Israel's control over the West Bank and Gaza. For Palestinians living in the occupied territories, these processes meant that a generation of youth became wage earners with dependent sources of income for the first time. So we saw the entire remaking of the political economy of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to both integrate and subordinate them to the Israeli economy. Fast forward to today, this system continues to assert its influence, especially in regulating the entry of essential goods into the occupied Palestinian territories. Palestinian economists have called the territories a captive economy. This arrangement translates into a multitude of ways that boost profits of Israel's largest companies. Firstly, the OPT stands as a significant market for Israeli goods. And with Palestinian consumption largely fueled by external capital, what we see is essentially the international system sending aid to Palestinians that ends up in Israeli coffers. So in all ways, this economic strangulation makes the entire economy both tightened, exploited, but also a profit maker for the Israeli state. Palestinians buy goods from Israel. Most of the goods can only come through Israel. And at the same time, international flows of aid that the international community decides to cut off is difficult for them to cut off because it does end up in Israeli coffers. Adding to this economic control is the absence of a distinct Palestinian currency, leaving the monetary system in the OPT subject to the influence of Israel's central bank. Israel also controls the taxations that Palestinians pay, and at their whims, they do not pay the taxes, which essentially means that money that should go to the Palestinian Authority to disperse in various ways is stolen by Israel because of the economic setup that was signed onto in the Israeli process. I am stressing this economic system because we cannot understand the Israeli settler colonial project without understanding this sense of strangulation of the Palestinian economy, the sense of subordinating the economy to make it difficult for people to withstand the settler colonial project. In the Gaza Strip, of course, we have seen an extreme form of this strangulation. We have seen a siege that has suffocated the economy of Gaza, and it is a testament to the people of Gaza that they are still able to survive under the strangulation of the economy. If you noted, with this latest assault in the first days, Israel had started to give some permits to Palestinian workers from Gaza, but those workers were quickly rounded up after October 7th, and they were treated horrifically. And you could see testimonies of how they were treated that are being collected by various organizations. I wanted to stress this political economic point because a lot of settler colonial analysis tends to forego what has happened to the Palestinian political economy, but also what is ongoing with Palestinian social formations and structures. Palestinians as a collective have been fragmented, but also there is a push to impoverish them and to then blame us for this poverty to begin with. The ramifications of this fragmentation, that's geographic, temporal, and economic, has far-reaching consequences. It contributes to a narrowing of political vision and imagination. We go from speaking about the right of return and liberation to only speaking in moderate terms within our small cantons. Fragmentation weakens collective identity as the social horizons contract to the confined borders of those cantons in which people happen to live. Ramallah is a striking example of this, as the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority ministries, international donors, and local NGOs that sometimes can have a life of its own because of this fragmentation. Circumscribed within these borders, people find it difficult to also conceive of alternative paths to action. This narrowing of vision becomes normalized. And I think what this latest assault on the Gaza Strip has done is to shake us out of normalizing the existing situation. There has been many work done over years to build boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. And in many ways, the tide is turning where people are understanding Israel as a settler colonial state and having a deeper analysis about how it functions. However, there is still a lot of work to be done. Understanding Israel as a settler colonial project that certainly practices apartheid policies and military occupation allows us to think of the overarching project to settle Palestine and ethnically cleanse its population from the river to the sea. That's why we need to always be reminded that Gaza is not a separate entity. It is part and parcel of the entirety of Palestine. Today, it is the best of us in Gaza that is seeking freedom loudly and clearly and speaking against fragmentation. For those of us in academic circles outside of the occupied territories and outside of Palestine, it is how to ensure that if there is a ceasefire tomorrow, the work doesn't just disappear and people don't just go home and forget that there's an ongoing siege. In a lot of the demonstrations internationally, the call has been ceasefire now. And certainly we want a ceasefire. We want an end to the brutality and the death. But the things do not go normal after a ceasefire. There is still a settler colonial project that is eating away at the Palestinian nation. It is a remarkable testament to my people that decades after this project, we are still here. And across all our locations, we continue to say we are Palestinian, but the work must continue and needs to continue in an organized way well after a ceasefire until Palestine is free. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafeef. Thanks. I'll invite Brenna to go ahead and speak.
Okay, thank you, Nadia, for this invitation and for everyone involved in the organizing of this seminar series. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the unceded lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. To say that their land is unceded means that they never gave it up. They never signed any treaties with the early colonial state. They did not sell their lands to the colonial crown. And we can see immediately when people in this moment are questioning the status of Israel as a settler colony, that even in this land acknowledgement, we can start to see the parallels, despite, of course, all of the differences as well. Now, the land acknowledgement is to recognize that there is no legitimate basis in law for the theft of Indigenous peoples' land here in British Columbia. And I understand this land acknowledgement not as some kind of trite admission or an acknowledgement of guilt for living on stolen land, but really as the starting point for a meaningful politics of decolonization. Now, I am really not sure where to begin this talk in this moment of acute crisis, but of course, a crisis with a very long history of its making, which Rafeef just spoke to. But I want to think about the place of law in the current conjuncture. And I will talk a little bit now about how many of us are mired in different forms of law and dealing with legality. How do we contemplate both the slow violence of the law, the normalization of Palestinian land dispossession through private laws of property, alongside the unrelenting and spectacular violence of the current warfare in Gaza? The slow violence of a settler colonial legality that has defined since 1948 the legal status of Palestinians as variously present absentees, a means of dispossession which is still in force in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And we have to consider in this moment how this law is going to be used yet again, given the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza. We can also think of the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel who, after the passing of the nation-state law in 2018, are not entitled to the right of self-determination, which is reserved solely for the Jewish people. We can think of the status of Palestinians as permanent residents of the occupied Palestinian territories and as people living under a military occupation. and as refugees exiled from historic Palestine. And all of these different legal statuses speak to the fragmentation that Rafeef just laid out for us. Now, the legal violence of land dispossession, displacement, and disenfranchisement, which are all interrelated, are also only part of the legal matrix of apartheid, which of course is parasitic on the larger substratum of colonial legality in Palestine and Israel. Alongside this slow legal violence, we can consider how law is currently being deployed in the struggle to end the genocide in Gaza. I am not an international lawyer, but in raising our voices to make the political claim to our states, not in my name, we have made the claim in the legal language recognized by the state. In demanding that the Prime Minister here in Canada call for a ceasefire, denounce the genocidal intent expressed by so many Israeli politicians, and hold any Canadian citizens participating in the commission of war crimes accountable under relevant domestic laws, we have turned very, very squarely to international law. The same body of law that we know was formed in the crucible of colonialism and continues to operate along neo-colonial lines of epistemic violence and raciality. We only need to look to the ICC's record of investigating and prosecuting countries which are not situated in the global south. Perhaps if we can be a little bit optimistic, we may see a different kind of Palestine exception with the ICC's decision to investigate crimes committed in the OPT by all parties in 2015. We only need to look at the way in which the ICJ's ruling on the apartheid wall, which came down 19 years ago, was for the most part rendered irrelevant by the continued construction of the wall by Israel. Yet in the current conjuncture, there is a political necessity to draw on legal language and the legal concepts governing the conduct of states during war. In Canada, the UK, France, and elsewhere, lawyers have lodged notices to prosecute the political leaders of these countries for the crime of aiding and abetting genocide. Here in Canada, we've also been drawing on a whole other panoply of laws: freedom of expression protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, laws of defamation, privacy laws as a defense to fishing expedition by Zionist claimants, and more generic legal norms of academic freedom and protection from harassment. I have never experienced or witnessed this much harassment at all levels. Most, if not all, of the claims that I've been privy to are utterly baseless. You know, on our campus at UBC this past week, we've seen the manufacturing of anti-Semitic propaganda by a Zionist organization on our campus as part of their attempt to smear a Students for Palestinian human rights group. So in this particular moment, along with all of our well-rooted critique of the coloniality of law, we are in this moment also mired in law and legalities. Now, we also know that the legal wrangling over whether genocide has yet been committed or will be seen to have been committed by the time these claims reach legal adjudication is perhaps necessary but far from sufficient. Using law as a political tactic to fight subjugation is vital, but how is law a continuation of political subjugation itself? I'm interested in how law and property law in particular is itself part of the weaponry of warfare. Property as warfare traverses both the mundane and quotidian aspects of colonial life, as well as these intensified moments of dispossession and displacement. While the term lawfare encapsulates the idea that law has long been the primary means of dispossession and exploitation in colonial contexts, I want here to think about the specificities of property law. and its place in two distinct but related concepts of warfare. On the one hand, we can consider the central role of property law in the long war against indigenous peoples throughout the Americas and elsewhere, with clear parallels in Palestine. The second concept of warfare, I think, relates to the sort of neoliberal fragmentation and the economic stranglehold that Rafeef just spoke to, but I'm going to just focus on the first idea of warfare here. We can see from a historical and juridical perspective international legal doctrines of colonial warfare being metabolized into domestic laws of property in order to continually reassert the legitimacy of colonial sovereignty over indigenous land, and also to quell challenges to colonial sovereignty by framing these challenges as a property dispute. Property as warfare operates through a juridical apparatus that has always sutured public state forms of sovereign power to private, individualized, and corporate ownership interests. The public-private divide, so central to liberal political philosophy and liberal legality, has always and continues to operate as a powerful legal fiction that is continually retooled in moments of crisis to counter emancipatory movements for change. The ongoing and now intensified violence in the West Bank, where settlers, backed by the state, routinely destroy Palestinian crops, homes, and use lethal violence against entire communities, reflects the recursive nature of property formation detailed by Rob Nichols in his book, Theft is Property. As Nichols argues, the doctrine of preemption was widely used as a means of retroactively legalizing the action of squatters. Inverting Proudhon's famous phrase, property is theft, Nichols has argued that the acts of dispossession are what recursively constitute relations that come to be recognized as property interests in the same moment that they are extinguished. So theft is property. The doctrine of preemption operated this way in 19th century America and also here in Canada, giving squatters the right of first refusal over land they had occupied illegally. And this remains the modality of dispossession of Palestinian lands in the West Bank currently. In the West Bank and perhaps elsewhere in Palestine, the appropriation of Palestinian land operates according to a logic of preemption, even though it may not be named as such. In the West Bank, Israeli settlers literally stake out Palestinian land as a means of solidifying Israeli control over Palestinian territory in the violation of international law. But there is an attempt to sanitize this violence and this violation by transmuting this land appropriation into a real estate transaction. The retroactive legalization of what are initially referred to as outposts, which are illegal under international laws of occupation, incorporate these settlements into Israeli domestic jurisdiction via laws that emulate colonial land legislation. The Israeli state gives individual settlers the right of first refusal over lands they have no legitimate claim over, excluding the original owners from the property regime that is constituted through reference to contractual principles of good faith, which I will talk about in a moment. I'm interested in understanding how preemption brings into being the settler subject through a presumed racial kinship with the colonial sovereign state. This racial kinship is ensconced within a legal form of property that has theological roots. In the West Bank, the theologically rooted claims to land are obviously extremely explicit, and this is nothing new. As H.S. Haddad's article, The Biblical Bases of Zionist Colonialism, published in 1974, explains, the Zionist settler movement and the Jewish National Fund in particular took passages from the Old Testament as their mandate. As he writes, the JNF's mandate, ostensibly based on biblical verse, is to, and I quote, purchase, develop, and settle lands as the inalienable property of the whole Jewish people, with restrictive covenants on the purchases so that Arabs may not buy or rent them, end quote. And we see the genocidal version of the recourse to the Old Testament in Netanyahu's reference to the Amalek nation and the holy war of their annihilation. Now, this theological form of property is laminated onto a racialized subject of ownership, which is fabricated through the secularization of property. And there's, of course, now we have to make reference to John Locke and his attempts to secularize the divine origins of private property ownership. In the settler colonial context, the doctrine of good faith becomes a means of creating a racial subject who is rendered constitutively innocent of the knowledge of indigenous ownership, and furthermore commits that subject to the nationalist belief that the land has no legitimate pre-existing owners. British Columbia, where I'm situated, may be the first colony to invent the category of the bona fide settler rather than the bona fide purchaser for value. So in property law, the concept of the good faith purchaser of property is a very old concept. And in the settler colony in British Columbia and also in Palestine, we see the creation of this category of the bona fide settler. So this is a good faith settler. It is this distinction between the bona fide settler versus the bona fide purchaser for value of property that is crucial to understanding how a legal doctrine such as good faith, so it's a legal doctrine of equity that is meant to protect individual purchasers of land, is actually retooled to legitimize the violent, illegal usurpation of indigenous land by settlers on behalf of a colonial state. Israel has deployed the concept of good faith to appropriate Palestinian land in several different instances. Israel's absentee property law of 1950 in Article 17 contained a good faith provision. So this is what this law from 1950 says. It says, and I quote, any transaction made in good faith between the custodian and another person in respect of property which the custodian considered at the time of the transaction to be vested property shall not be invalidated and shall remain in force even if it is proved that the property was not at the time vested property. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Now, we see this same phrase being repeated over and over in laws relating to land. Article 5 of the Order regarding government property of Judea and Samaria of 1967 repeats this language, but updates the terminology a bit. The doctrine of good faith makes further appearances in Israeli laws that seek to sanitize the illegal actions of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem in particular. In 2013, the government enacted a market amendment that retroactively legalized 2,000 housing units in the West Bank. The amendment included the clause, and here I quote, that transactions made in good faith between the custodian of government property in territories and another person, meaning a settler, regarding a property the custodian believed at the time to be a government property is valid even if the land did not belong to the state, end quote. So what that means is that based on the idea of having a good faith belief that the property was not owned by a Palestinian makes it legally legitimate to appropriate. Crucially, good faith pertains only to the relationship between the custodian and the settler. So trying to determine, well, was the land held in good faith, in the good faith belief that there was no other owner, is a a determination that is made solely between the custodian and the settler. The kin relationship between these two parties is sedimented, and Palestinians are rendered juridically non-existent. The mere belief that land was state land, even when it was clearly not, and in the face of Palestinian resistance and assertion of property rights, both on the ground and in the courts, transmutes colonial land theft into a land transaction that has a practically sacred status above any legal reproach. And of course, that concept of good faith has theological dimensions as well. So this is only possible if the juridical framework for good faith contractual relations is in fact constituted through bad faith in a Sartrean sense. That is, it is only by presupposing that the ideal of coexistence is actually an impossibility, and that the fundamental and constitutionally enshrined contradiction between being a supposedly democratic and Jewish state, and I refer to the work of Mazen Masri there, can only be resolved in one way, that good faith can come to signify the expulsion of Palestinians from the juridical framework of property relations. The violent expulsion of Palestinians from their homes and villages in the West Bank by a movement emboldened by members of the Knesset who are self-described fascists and who are part of the radical settler movement, which has now, of course, become mainstream, certainly takes the notion of bad faith to a different and more extreme variation. This is perhaps what we can then think through as a form of colonial fascism, where the theological racial dimensions of property are materialized through ethnic cleansing. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm sorry if that wasn't entirely coherent.
Oh no, not at all. Thanks, Brenna. No, that was really very helpful and very. I mean, I think there will be a conversation. I'll open it up to our audience to see again. If you would like to ask a question, please just raise your hand, and then I'll give you the permission to speak. If that's okay, I'm going to see if we have some comments. Okay, Anis, is it?
Yes, hello. First of all, thank you so much for having this conference, and Dr. Brenna and Rafeef for being here with us. My question is directed to Dr. Rafeef. You spoke of the colonial economy of Palestine as an infrastructure that not only siphons domestic and foreign Palestinian resources that come to Palestine, but also generates profit at the expense of Palestinian lives. And the consequences of this megastructure are like really far-reaching in terms of its entrenchment, and it's been going on for so long that the consequences, we can see them on every aspect of Palestinian life, even in terms of healthcare and their span of life. All of it is being eroded for the sake of this colonial economy. So if we take this into account in terms of its entrenchment and the perverse efficiency of this system, BDS has clarified the role of people living outside of Palestine in terms of what to do to undermine this system. But do you envision some kind of role for Palestinians living in Palestine to undermine it? And I'm not saying that necessarily there should be one, because they are still victims of this colonial system, but do you see a role for them to play, whether it is economic in terms of their economic activity, or even maybe just strictly militarily speaking?
Thank you, Anis.
Would you like me to respond or take a few questions together?
Well, I'm looking. It seems like it's the only one we have for now. Perhaps if you want to say something, and then people can have a minute to think. Yeah.
Thank you, Anis, for that very, very interesting and good question. I don't get asked enough about Palestinian political economy, so I'm very excited when I get good questions about it. You are certainly correct about the clarification of BDS internationally. One thing I would say is we also need to think of Palestine and this colonial economy in the regional context as well. when we say there's resource theft, there's also the gas resources in the Mediterranean, for example, that are shared through several states, being Lebanon as well. So we're not, quite often nowadays, we have the conversation around Palestine as if it's divorced from the broader region. And I think we need to bring that conversation back to the regional scale as well, and the resources regionally. Just before this latest assault on Gaza, there were all the conversations around Israel and the Suez Canal, for example, and access to the Suez Canal. So we cannot divorce the Palestinian existence and the colonial economy that Israel is trying to impose from also the resources of our region more broadly. The normalization projects going on, for example, with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are also about resources in the region. They're also about oil in the region, how it's distributed, how that wealth is distributed. And I think that conversation about Palestine in the region is a very important one to think through and to start to bring back. I know that organizers in Jordan, for example, are starting to discuss the question of gas and electricity and the normalization projects there. Of course, we know there is a lot of repression in the region. It's very difficult to have these campaigns nowadays. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about the various conditions in the various Arab states and how restrictive they have become. But certainly there is a core role to play for those activists that are closest in terms of geographically to where the state of Israel is today, but also at a regional level to start having these campaigns, at a minimum, against the economic normalization projects. If you specifically look at what happened after the normalization with the United Arab Emirates, the first things that started to get normalized were infrastructures around logistics and trade and food. I've written an entire paper about food logistics in the region, but we are seeing two logistical pillars starting to pull together for the food resources in the region, and that is the United Arab Emirates and Israel. So there's an axis here for the resources of the region, whether be it water, gas, food, that is being distributed in a way that is not for the good of the people of the region. And we need, as organizers in the region, to start thinking about how we do these campaigns. The difficulty, of course, is doing them under the restrictions and the repression that we face. And I know people are having these conversations about how to start to do it in various ways.
Thank you. Thanks. So I don't see comments from the audience, but maybe I could just jump in here with a clarification. I mean, I think both the talks are extremely linked, and it's clear from kind of thinking about fragmentation and its different mechanisms. And I really appreciate both of what you presented here. But I think my question is more about, perhaps there was more intricacies about the mechanism in relationship to the question of land that Brenna brought up. And I just wanted to clarify. So, I mean, you're explaining, I mean, I think this is kind of something we should all, become more and more aware of. So, I mean, the way that the laws around private property, when you say the custodian versus the settler, right, that relationship. So here the state is the custodian, right? So in the moment that the state of Israel is declared as a custodian of the land, then these are the laws of private property that are put into place. As you rightly obviously said, this is like the Lockean, whatever kind of secularization of private property. You can work the land in good faith, you can put labor into it, make something out of it. It is private. It is, you can, you can draw the boundaries, you can do all that. And so the question is here, I suppose, if we want to again kind of connect what's happening in Palestine to global political, economic conditions of injustice, that is this just a kind of a perversion of the already existing law of private property, the kind of Lockean model that has been mostly at work? And I mean, I don't know if one can globalize the law of private property in the same way that one can talk about wage relations and all these other things, but would you say this is kind of what is exposed in the settler colonial framework is a perversion of the law of private property? Because you're saying it's something that happens as doubled. So it's like the locked secularization of the covenant is taken again and kind of re-theologized or kind of returned in the settler colony, but kept with its secular appearance. So there's something like there's a perversion happening there that's interesting. That, I mean, it seems to expose anyways the complete absurdity of the law of private property on a universal scale, right? I mean, I just wanted you, perhaps both of you have a comment on this, given, I don't know, but Brenna, and yeah, thanks. Yeah, just.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the kind of secularization, but then the re-theolization in the Palestinian context by Israel, for sure. I mean, I tend to think that these laws of property are not being perverted in the settler colonial context. They're being sort of perfected in the settler colonial context. So, you know, I think that modern laws of property, and when we think about settler colonialism or indeed other forms of colonialism, we tend to think about it, or many people seem to think that the laws were kind of transported to the colonies and imposed. And in fact, what we see is in some ways the reception of laws, but also the creation of different property logics that are in some instances then exported back. So there's a relationship in the formation of modern laws of property where we can see that colonialism is actually quite central to the development of modern laws of property. And we can also see how these logics travel between different colonial sites, particularly from the 19th century onwards. But these modes of dispossession and the property logics that they're rooted in, which is also to say the racial logics they are rooted in, are also developing, during the same historical moments. And even though we tend to think that the dispossession of indigenous lands here happened in the past, and it happened and it's over, and the property logics I'm speaking about were developing also in the colonization of Palestine within a time frame that is not that far apart, in fact. And of course, when we look at the ongoing dispossession of indigenous peoples here and Palestinians there are many similarities in how that's operating, and that is the continuing development and evolution of modern property law. That it's not separate from the forms, and this is why the property is warfare. I didn't really speak about that other trajectory of thinking about how property operates as a form of warfare is through neoliberal forms of extractivism. It's a different concept of warfare, right? It's that concept that is coming out of a more Marxian tradition of thinking about crisis and the welfare to the warfare state, etc. But when we look at neoliberal forms of extractivism that are happening through real estate in urban centers, it is happening on a global level. So that is not contained to a kind of settler colonial space versus Europe or versus other places. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Nadia, but that's some of what comes to mind.
No, thanks. Yeah, that's that really kind of, yes, it does answer the question. I mean, I won't hog this. I'll let other people speak. Rima, I've tried to follow. Rima, yeah.
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you so much, Rafeef and Brenna, for two very insightful comments. I wanted to ask in line with the previous questions, but I wanted to ask a bit more about the contradiction of, in the context of settler colonialism in Palestine, it's not only about labor exploitation, right? In the contradiction or the inability of, in the context of genocide or ethnic cleansing of social reproduction of the labor force to begin with the how do we couple this with the need of the Israeli economy for cheap labor that in many cases come in the shape of Palestinian labor? So it's in moments like the ones we're living now, where where there is, this the genocidal tendencies of this type of settler colonialism is obvious, that this contradiction becomes even clearer. So I wanted to hear a bit more what you think about this. How do we think about the political economy in the context of ethnic cleansing?
We'll take another question to give you a minute to think about that. That was a is it Tom?
Yes, hello.
Yeah,
Thank you again, Dr. Bhandar and Dr. Ziadah. I guess my question is more in line with the first one, perhaps directed at Dr. Ziadah. You've sort of talked a bit about the Palestinian political economy, and we sort of understand it now within the context of neoliberalism of the past 40 years. It is more intertwined with the global economy than ever before. And I was wondering if you could instead talk about less the internal politics, but perhaps the external politics of solidarity, and how have sort of acts of solidarity and acts of resistance against sort of the occupation of Palestine change over time as you see a shift in the sort of nature of the political economy of Palestine. I mean, you see a lot of the stuff with like the Block the Boat in California and Australia, the Belgian port workers. Yeah, I mean, how has acts of solidarity and resistance Palestine changed as the political economy has globalized and become more, intertwined with everyone else? Thank you.
Thank you for the great questions. I guess one thing I will start with is we sometimes make this distinction in our heads that there was no neoliberalism, and then suddenly there was neoliberalism and the political economy changed. And what I was trying to get at with the historicization is that the shift to Palestinian social formation began with in 1948, but also in 1967. It was the dispossession from land that then turns many Palestinians from farmers to laborers, and that labor then gets dispersed across the region. I mean, we haven't had a chance to speak about Palestinian labor within the region. So it's not that there is a question of land dispossession and labor, and those are separate. It is because of land dispossession that Palestinian labor formation takes the shape that it does. It's because Palestinians were dispossessed from their land that they became wage laborers in various ways. A lot of refugees became laborers in Gulf states and ended up being teachers or educators or construction workers. So that there's a history there that is a link between ethnic cleansing, land theft, and what happens to labor formation. So I just wanted to clarify that, because there is a change that happens with neoliberalism in terms of the Oslo Accords coming in, supposedly opening up of the Palestinian economy. But what we have seen is a much deeper dependency of the Palestinian economy. It's closing down even more. But Israel realized the strength of Palestinian labor during the first Intifada, and worked during those strikes, because there were strikes, because the impact of Palestinian organized labor was quite important to the Intifada. It worked to switch that labor from being Palestinian to South Asian labor. And that has been its trajectory. That's why in the past month, if you see, one of the things they did was try to import workers from India. And we've had Indian unions actually refuse and say, we don't want to send labor. So it tried as hard as it could to sever its relationship and dependency on Palestinian labor. And that is one mechanism that also weakened Palestinian influence and power when there is protest, in that it did sever the economy. And the Oslo Accords, of course, produced this horrific image of your best World Bank, IMF blueprint that you could have of a situation of total economic subordination of the experiment of the Palestinian Authority. Within that context, Palestinian labor has become even more fragmented between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Just before, again, this latest onslaught, I was working on a report about Palestinian labor during the COVID moment. And one of the things you see clearly is the fragmentation of Palestinian labor institutions. So trade unions are now split between Gaza and the West Bank, and they have different formations and they barely speak to each other. The Palestinian Authority treats Palestinian labor in Gaza completely separately and differently than it does. Palestinian Authority hadn't been paying its employees, and it pays differently to employees in the West Bank and Gaza. So there's quite a lot to say about the conditions of Palestinian labor and how it was treated. There is something, I think, for us to think about around the categories of international law and why they are the dominant framework in analyzing Palestine, not different categories around political economy, labor, etc. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it's quite important. I got asked a very big question about international solidarity. Yes, there has been a lot of actions taking place. The shift that has happened isn't so much because of the neoliberalization of the economy, but because of the call to tackle complicity. So it's been a very targeted call to say internationally, please target your institutions which are complicit in what's happening in Palestine. So that means university professors tend to tackle their pension funds to work in their universities. Dock workers can do actions like block the boat. There are, of course, strategic locations that the Palestinian movement or those of us who work around labor unions have tried to speak about. So docks and dock worker actions are very strategic. 3 weeks ago, workers in Palestine issued a call for a military embargo, asking internationally for people to focus their efforts on the arms trade. And we have seen some remarkable trade union actions around arms factories and the arms trade. It's very tricky work to do. These moments also highlight the solidarity with Palestine, but they also highlight the weaknesses of the international movement as well. So we're trying to work on both strands, strengthening the organizing that's happening while we're in a genocidal moment. But definitely it has highlighted that there are key levers that are important to tackle in our solidarity, but also that the work needs to continue in between actions and mobilizations. What tends to happen is there's an attack on Gaza, everybody starts organizing and then goes back to bed for a few years until there's another attack. And that really weakens our mobilizations. And that's why I'm insisting on consistency after this moment. If we want, everyone keeps referring to a South Africa moment. If we want that, we need to consistently organize.
Thanks for that. Brenna, did you have a comment on the question? Okay. So maybe a quick follow-up here. So I guess, Rafeef, what you're saying is not to reduce the question of what's happening in Palestine simply to the terms of legality, nor just morality. You're insisting on the necessity to kind of create links that have to do with conditions of injustice that can be thought or considered outside simply the implosion of how we're seeing them happening in Palestine, but that can link to things all over the world. Is that kind of what you're suggesting here, or just to kind of keep working, right? To keep thinking and working through the problems that we are, yeah.
So we've had a bit of an inversion in the Palestinian case, where rather than using international law as a tool for the movement, international law has become the only framework by which we see Palestine. And that tends to really obfuscate the realities on the ground, because international law doesn't account necessarily for political economy, it doesn't account for labor, it doesn't account for the daily experiences of Palestinians, it has its blind spots. I mean, people like Brenna and others have written a lot about the limitations of the law. But the fact that this has become our crying call is largely because also as a Palestinian body politic, we are quite fragmented right now. and international law seems to be the only language that we have been relying on. So what I'm trying to argue is we need to understand the long-term shifts in Palestinian political economy, social formation, the basis of the Oslo Accords and what they have done to Palestinian politics, and reimagine and reformulate our imaginary of freedom, where international law can become a tool for that, rather than the only framework we know how to use.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of follow up on what Rafeef said, I think it's been, obviously many people have written marvelous work on how the human rights framework has impacted the struggle for freedom and liberation, right? Because the language of freedom and liberation far exceeds and in some ways contradicts the framework of human rights and that kind of liberal legality. And we can also think about how, and I think this is what we really need to challenge when it comes to the way in which law is figuring in the current moment, is the language of humanitarianism, which many people have written about now for some time. But in a different webinar where Suhad Bishara was speaking, actually much closer to the right in the aftermath of October 7th, she said this is not a humanitarian issue. I mean, of course it is in the most immediate sense of people physically surviving. But I think what she meant is that to reduce the current situation down to one of international law, one to war crimes, is to lose focus on what's really at stake here in a way. And we can think about how in the past, relying on international legal fora as a remedy to gross injustices has done very little to actually root out the ideological, the political, and the economic conditions which give rise to what we are seeing in Gaza right now, right? This is the criticism of all of the post-Holocaust, post-World War II atrocities, all of the international criminal trials, the Nuremberg trials. This is we are witnessing now with the rise of fascism in a way, the way in which fascism, which was a part of the social fabric of particular places, was not rooted out through these trials that focus on individual perpetrators. And so, I think while we, as I was trying to articulate that when we need to speak immediately the language of the state to stop the bombing, then we use the language of the law. But I think it's very important because also using the language of the law and using the law takes enormous resources and energy and attention and focus. It's not easy to engage with the law. It's just given the nature of legal processes, etc. So I think it's quite important to consider the limits of the law and also how these legal claims need to be used politically and tactically, rather than thinking that the recourse to international law is going to lead to the kind of liberation that people have been struggling for so very long.
Thank you, Brenna. I can see if there's any further questions or comments from our audience. If you have one, please just raise a hand or. Well, I don't see any further comments. We still have some time, so well, shall we would either of you like to add something to the discussion, or any further points you'd like to make, or given that we have some time, I mean, we can also end early. There's no I mean, maybe can I just, I mean, there's a comment that Brenna just made, which I thought was, you know, I think, you know, I think this distinction that you make, you know, or that you know, others have also made, but that you're pointing to this question of how the limits of the human kind of rights law approach deals with the kind of categories of, you know, victims and perpetrators, but I suppose kind of disavows or removes from the equation the question of the beneficiaries, or the beneficiaries of the violence, or the, you know, the, in political economic terms, the ones who have actually reaped profit out of the violence or out of what has happened, right? And it seems like that kind of distinction is important to kind of link back, I think, to yeah, Rafeef was saying about the importance of kind of forefronting the question of political economy, or how to think about that, in the sense that they're not so disengaged. I mean, it seems like there are two facets of the kind of contradictions of, I don't know, kind of global capital and its colonial enterprise in a way, or the way that kind of, you know, accumulates, not historically simply precedent, but kind of, you know, continues to originally accumulate. But I mean, I think here, I just wanted to point something which last week in our second panel of the series, we had a number of scholars from Birzeit University who were speaking, and there was kind of a hesitancy on their part to kind of simply fold into the kind of indigeneity argument on the way that it has kind of developed, in the sense, because I think that if I understood them correctly, and if I haven't, is that the fear that the indigeneity question has only led to the actual complete dispossession. I mean, it's what you get is only kind of, you know, we recognize, you know, as you began, which is, you know, you have to recognize that, you know, someone has been dispossessed, but that somehow becomes the fear of becoming in that position where history already is ahead, and the Palestinians are again, you know, conflated with the question of indigeneity. I mean, it was interesting, and I think to sense that kind of anxiety around that kind of framework from within Palestine. I mean, from within the kind of the engagements that we had in the previous panel. I don't know if you would have any immediate comments or ideas about this. I mean, either of you, just to kind of, yeah.
Brenna, did you want to go first?
No, I want you to go first, and then I will say something.
Okay.
I guess what we've seen in Palestine studies over the past 10, 15 years probably is a quest for frameworks. And we kind of lurch from one framework to the next. People argued for genocide for some time, that what's ongoing is well, first it was people arguing for ethnic cleansing, then it was argument for genocide, then it was argument for apartheid, then it was argument for a settler colonial framework, now it's an argument about indigeneity, and we kind of lurch from these frameworks. And I think that's partly because of the realities on the ground, and kind of academics trying to keep up with what's happening in these frameworks, but the debates end up being so much about the frameworks. And that's why I like going back to the materiality of the situation of Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, Palestinian refugees, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. We are dispersed among many different locations. And sometimes, for me personally, the debates around frameworks become a bit like esoteric and academic, but that's a reflection on, I think, the wider moment in Palestinian politics right now, where we don't have a unifying kind of ideological thread or unifying body that's bringing everything together. I'm familiar with the academic debates around indigeneity and why people don't want to use it and why they want to use it. I think there's nuance there. I think indigenous scholars have also done a lot of work around this framework. One thing that was worrying me for some time, and Brenna and I wrote an article about it, was that people were making a temporal distinction between indigenous people in Palestine and other indigenous communities and saying, well, those communities have disappeared, but we are still here and that's our future. And I think temporally that's extremely problematic because there are indigenous communities that are resisting to this day. And to make this assumption that that has happened and their past is our future, I think is a bit I mean, in terms of solidarity, it's not very conducive to solidarity with indigenous communities that are still struggling to this day. And that's largely what drove me to write that article with Brenna. I didn't think it was useful to make that temporal distinction in that way. The other side of it is, of course, what Brenna was mentioning earlier, around the circulation of modes of law and dominance across settler colonies, that it was a learning process from colonial situations to settler colonial situations, and it was circulating. So when we say Israel is a settler colonial project, it is similar to other projects, but not identical. So the question of labor here is very important. So the South Africa under apartheid apartheid is a form of settler colonialism. It's a special type of settler colonialism. So there, labor formation was a completely different story. The role labor played was really large. The numbers were much larger. The industries they were in were bigger. So for me, analyzing each situation with its particularities, with its materiality, with the position of labor, with its particular political economy, and the organizers and the movements that are making things happen is the starting point, rather than the starting point being the frameworks themselves. And I'll just leave it at that.
I actually started, when I was trying to write out my notes and comments for today, started writing a paper about the land acknowledgement because the last 6 or 7 weeks have crystallized for me what the land acknowledgement means for the vast majority of scholars who make them. I'll just speak about the legal field because that's the field that I'm in. But it's become clear to me that the land acknowledgement for most people, the vast majority, I think, of non-Indigenous scholars, of course, is made with a deep sense of security that there's nothing at risk. So I can acknowledge and I can be, very maybe sober and have this kind of affect in acknowledging the land as possession, but it's in the knowledge that the existing arrangement is not really going to be messed up too much. And I say that, and having become, more wary of this tendency recently, because when the land dispossession is happening in such an intensified and brutal way, in a place where your own state is complicit in it, so it is in your own backyard. It's not somewhere far away that you don't have a connection to. And many of our universities have very close affiliations with Israeli universities. So, there's a direct connection to what's happening as far as I'm concerned, besides just being a human or a person of conscience. There are these concrete ties. And I think the silence of the vast majority of legal academics around what's happening shows me that the land acknowledgement for most people is not a political act. It's not a political gesture. It's something else. And so I think that speaks to the worry that Rafeef was just talking about, that in using a settler colonial framework, you do walk into that kind of temporalization or that periodization. I find that I will use a settler colonial framework to examine the legal infrastructure of occupation in Palestine, but do not necessarily use the language of indigeneity. and maybe the language of native and settler is more seems more apt. And one reason why I don't use the language of indigeneity in relationship to Palestinians is because Palestinians don't really use the language of indigeneity to describe their struggle. And so, I mean, of course, you know, I don't mean to overgeneralize, but that term, as it's been taken up in legal actions on the part of the Bedouin communities in the Nakab, for instance, has been challenged by Palestinian lawyers, in part because it adds an extra layer of fragmentation to the Palestinian struggle, right? So and now I'm thinking that maybe using the language of colonialism rather than settler colonialism might be a way of getting away from what has become a massive distraction and this very academicized debate over whether you can't call Israel a settler colony, how dare you? And that, you know, that becomes actually such a distraction because that is used to delegitimize, undermine the critique that is being made, you know, of the occupation. So yeah, I think these are as Rafeef said, you know, these are frameworks. People are searching, understandably, for frameworks of analysis to understand the situation, but we have to be quite aware of their limits, and we have to be willing to, you know, use different language that helps us understand the material basis of Palestinian dispossession.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a great, I mean, I think this is really important also because we all know in a way the way that critical discourse or critique can also be so in so many ways co-opted by the very neoliberal apparatuses that it seeks to, I don't know, dismantle. There's a particular relationship between these two things that makes it more important, I think, to kind of think through the frameworks and connect them to, you know, the existing or actual kind of conditions of domination and exploitation. Well, I mean, I think this might bring us to our final, to the end of the session. Would you like to add anything, Rafeef, or sorry, I thought maybe I misread your, yeah, okay. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank you both for taking the time and for your, you know, we have a lot of messages in the chat, people who had to leave saying, you know, thanking you for the talks. And yeah, thanks so much for being with us. And we hope we can continue these conversations over time in a better short to come future. I don't know. Okay. So
thank you very much, Nadia. Thank you, Rafeef.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Bye.